They didn't know who he was. That was the first mistake. The parking lot was quiet. The kind of quiet that sits heavy in the air. Just one old diner off the highway, flickering neon sign, smell of coffee and oil. Steven Seagal stepped outside alone. No cameras, no bodyguards, no rush. He paused for a moment, breathing in the night air, unaware that eyes were already on him. Then the sound came. Engines low at first, distant, like thunder rolling across asphalt. Lone motorcycle, then another, then many more. The sound grew louder, closer, until it wrapped around the diner like a warning. Steven turned slowly. Headlights flicked on one by one, forming a wide circle around him. Leather jackets, heavy boots, scarred knuckles, gripping handlebars, dozens of bikers. They cut their engines at the same time. Silence. A thick, dangerous silence. Lone biker laughed. Another spat on the ground. "Well, look at this," someone said. "Guy walks out here like he owns the place." Steven didn't move, didn't run, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, calm, balanced, watching. The leader rolled forward, stopping inches away, tall, bearded, cold eyes. "You lost, old man?" he asked. Steven's voice was steady. Number that answer alone shifted something in the air. The bikers expected fear, begging, anger. But not calm. The leader narrowed his eyes. "You got guts standing there like that." Steven looked around slowly, counting them. Not with panic, with focus. "I'm just standing," he said. "You're the ones surrounding me." A few bikers chuckled. Others didn't laugh at all. The leader leaned closer. "You know what happens when someone disrespects our crew." Steven met his stare. "I know what happens when people mistake confidence for weakness." That was when the circle tightened. Boots hit pavement. Chains clinked. A hand reached behind a jacket. No one noticed the small shift in Steven's stance, the way his weight settled, the way his hands relaxed instead of tensing. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. And every biker there was about to realize something terrifying. They didn't surround a victim. They surrounded the wrong guy. The circle tightened. Not fast, not rushed, slow enough to feel deliberate. Boots scraped against pavement as the bikers closed in, tightening the ring inch by inch. Chains clinked softly. Leather creaked. Someone cracked their neck. Someone else laughed. Sharp, nervous, trying to sound confident. Steven Seagal noticed everything. The rhythm of their steps. Who moved first? Who hesitated? Who watched his hands instead of his face? He didn't turn his head quickly. He didn't square his shoulders like a man preparing to fight. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, barely noticeable. The kind of adjustment most people would miss. But it changed everything. The leader rolled his bike forward again, stopping close enough that Steven could smell gasoline and old leather. "You're real calm for a guy surrounded by 40 men, he said. Steven's voice stayed low, controlled. Calm keeps people alive. A ripple moved through the group. Not laughter this time. Unease. One of the bikers muttered, "Man talks like he's done this before." The leader shot him a glance, then looked back at Steven. "You think this is some kind of movie?" Steven tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "Movies end fast." That landed harder than any insult. The leader stepped off his bike. Up close, he was bigger than most men Steven had faced in years. Thick arms, heavy shoulders, the kind of strength that came from weight and years of violence. He walked a slow circle around Steven, like a predator measuring distance. "You know what happens when someone gets in our way?" the leader said. Steven didn't follow him with his eyes. "I know what happens when people forget they have a choice." That stopped the leader mid-step. "What choice?" Steven finally turned his head. To walk away. The silence that followed was dangerous. Someone behind Steven snorted. "Who does this guy think he is?" Steven answered without turning. "Someone who doesn't want anyone hurt tonight." That was the moment the mood shifted, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. No challenge, no bravado, no fear. The leader's jaw tightened. "You don't get to decide that." He nodded once. That was the signal. A biker to Steven's left stepped forward too fast. Angry, eager, reckless. He swung a chain low, aiming for Steven's legs. Steven moved, not backward. Sideways, the chain missed by inches, whipping through empty air before the biker could recover. Steven stepped inside the swing, his hand snapping up, 2 fingers pressing sharply into the man's neck. The biker collapsed, gasping, confused, alive but helpless. Silence exploded. What the? Another biker rushed in from behind. Steven pivoted, using the first man's falling body as cover. A short movement. A twist of the wrist. The second attacker hit the pavement hard, breath knocked out of him. 2 men down. No punches thrown. No rage shown. Just efficiency. The circle broke for the first time. Bike shifted. Men stepped back. Someone cursed. The leader raised a hand. Hold. Steven stood still again, hands at his sides, breathing steady. You still want this? Steven asked. The leader stared, not at Steven's face, at his feet, at the balance, the stance. Recognition crept in. You're trained, the leader said quietly. Steven didn't deny it. I've trained most of my life. A murmur spread through the group. How old is this guy? That wasn't luck. He didn't even hit them. The leader took a step back. Who are you? Steven met his eyes. Simone, you don't need to fight to respect. Another long pause. Then something unexpected happened. One of the bikers, younger, less hardened, removed his helmet. Boss, he said quietly, this ain't worth it. The leader clenched his fists. He looked at the men on the ground, then at the others, no longer eager, no longer smiling. Finally, he exhaled. This ends now, he said. Engines restarted. Slower than before. The sound wasn't thunder anymore. It was retreat. Steven stepped back toward the diner door. Before going inside, he turned once more. Next time, he said calmly, choose peace first. Then he walked inside like nothing had happened, and every biker there knew the truth. They didn't back down because they were weak. They backed down because they had just met someone far more dangerous than violence itself. The diner door closed behind Steven Seagal with a soft chime. Inside, the air felt different. Every conversation had stopped. Forks hovered above plates. Coffee cups paused mid-lift. They had all heard the engines. They had all heard the silence that followed. Steven walked back to his booth like nothing had happened. He sat down slowly, adjusted his jacket, and picked up his coffee. It was still warm. He took a sip, calm as ever. A waitress stood frozen behind the counter. You okay, sir? She asked finally. Steven nodded. Everyone is. That answer confused her more than anything else. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty now. Only 2 bikes remained. Their riders still catching their breath, sitting on the curb where they'd fallen. They weren't hurt, just shaken, humbled. The leader stood a short distance away, helmet under his arm, staring at the diner door. He replayed it all in his head, the movement, the precision, the restraint. This wasn't rage. This wasn't ego. This was someone who knew exactly how much damage he could do, and chose not to. One of the bikers approached him quietly. That guy, who was he? The leader shook his head. Doesn't matter. But it did. Inside the diner, the older cook leaned out from the kitchen. What the hell was that about? He whispered. Steven glanced up, misunderstanding. The cook frowned. Didn't sound like one. Steven smiled faintly. Most things aren't until they are. A trucker at the counter finally spoke. You didn't even look scared. Steven didn't answer right away. He stirred his coffee slowly. Fear makes noise, he said. Calm listens. That stuck phones came out. Not to film now, but to text. To tell stories, to exaggerate. You won't believe what just happened outside this diner. Some old guy dropped 2 bikers without throwing a punch. Dude moved like he'd done it 1,000 times. Outside, the leader finally mounted his bike. Before starting it, he looked back at the diner one last time. In another life, he would have gone back inside, demanded a name, demanded respect. But tonight taught him something different. Real power doesn't ask. Engines fired up. The remaining bikers rode off, slower than they arrived. No revving, no posturing, Just quiet. Minutes passed. The diner slowly returned to life. Plates clinked. Someone laughed nervously. The neon sign buzzed again. The waitress brought Steven his check on the house. "Thanks," she said softly, "for not making it worse." Steven stood. "Wasn't necessary," he replied. As he walked toward the door, the trucker spoke again. "You some kind of fighter." "I'm a student," he said. "Always have been." Outside, the night air felt lighter now. Steven looked up at the stars briefly, something most people didn't notice anymore, then walked toward his car. Across town, the story was already growing. By morning, it would be legend. By next week, it would be a warning. About the kind of man you don't recognize until it's too late. Not because he hides power, but because he doesn't need to show it. And for every biker who rode away that night, one truth stayed with them longer than the bruises ever would. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest, isn't the angriest, isn't the one looking for a fight. It's the one who stays calm when everyone else loses control. Because calm like that is earned, and once you recognize it, you never forget it. 3 weeks passed. The highway diner went back to being just a diner. Same flickering neon sign, same burnt coffee, same stretch of asphalt where nothing ever seemed to happen. But people remembered. Truckers talked, bikers talked, mechanics, bartenders, gas station clerks. They all talked. The story changed depending on who told it. Some said the man dropped 4 bikers. Others swore it was 6. A few claimed he never touched anyone, that they just fell. But every version agreed on one thing: the man never raised his voice, never chased anyone, never stayed to be praised. And that made the story grow legs. Across the region, biker crews began using the story as a warning, not about him, but about themselves. Don't start what you can't finish. Watch the quiet ones. Respect before force. The leader from that night felt it the most. He didn't talk about it, didn't brag, didn't defend himself. But he noticed changes. People looked at him differently now, not with fear, but with expectation, like they wanted to see if he'd learned something. At a gas stop outside a small town, a young rider finally asked him, "Why didn't you go back inside? Get his name?" The leader stared out at the road before answering. "Because names don't matter when the lesson sticks." That rider didn't fully understand. Yet, meanwhile, life moved on. The man from the diner didn't disappear, but he didn't chase attention either. He traveled quietly, ate alone, watched people more than places. At another roadside stop weeks later, something familiar happened. A group of men were arguing near the pumps, loud, aggressive, posturing for an audience. One of them noticed the quiet man leaning against his car. "Hey," the guy snapped. "You staring?" The man shook his head calmly, just passing through. The argument fizzled, not because of fear, because something in his presence slowed things down. The men walked away, unsure why. That was the strange part. The effect wasn't force, it was gravity. Back at the original diner, the waitress kept telling the story to new hires, always lowering her voice near the end. "He didn't win," she'd say. "He ended it." One night, months later, motorcycles rolled into the parking lot again. The cook froze. The waitress stiffened, but this time there was no circle. No engines revving. Just a few riders walking inside calmly. They ordered food, paid in cash, said please and thank you. As they left, one of them paused by the door. "Tell him," the biker said, almost awkwardly. "We said thanks." "For what?" the waitress asked. "For showing us another way." The biker left before she could ask anything else. Far away, the leader rode alone on a stretch of empty highway, helmet tucked under his arm at a rest stop. He thought about that night often, not with anger, not with shame. With clarity, he understood now that power wasn't about how many people feared you, it was about how many didn't need to. He'd started changing small things, stepping in earlier, lowering his voice instead of raising it, walking away when walking away made sense. The crew noticed. So did he. And somewhere down another road, the quiet man continued on, untouched by the echo of the story behind him. He didn't know how many people it had changed, didn't care to. That was never the point. The point was simple. Every action leaves something behind. Not always bruises. Sometimes direction. And the rarest kind of strength. The kind that shows up once, then keeps working long after it's gone. Because legends don't shout. They don't linger. They move on. And let the world adjust itself in their wake. Almost a year passed. Seasons changed. Roads stayed the same. Some stories fade with time. This one didn't. It stopped growing louder, but it grew deeper. Like a scar you stop noticing until something brushes against it and reminds you it's there. The leader rode alone more often now. Not because the crew had broken apart, they hadn't, but because distance gave him space to think. On a long ride through a mountain pass, rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. Enough to chill the bones. A familiar diner appeared ahead. Different sign. Same kind of place. He almost rode past it. Almost, but something pulled him in. Inside, it was warm. Quiet. A few travelers scattered through coffee brewing. The smell of grease and rain-soaked jackets. He took off his helmet and sat near the window. Then he saw him. Older now, maybe, or maybe just calmer, which makes time look different. Steven Seagal sat alone near the back, reading. No one paid him much attention. The leader froze. For the first time since that night, his heart beat fast, not fear, recognition. He considered leaving. Instead, he stood. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Not because the man was dangerous, but because this moment mattered. Steven looked up before the leader spoke. Not startled, not surprised. Just aware. You're a long way from that night, Steven said calmly. The leader exhaled. So are you. A pause. Then Steven gestured to the empty chair. Sit. The leader did. They didn't speak right away. Coffee was poured. Rain tapped against the window. Finally, the leader spoke. I came to apologize. Steven nodded once. I figured. For surrounding you. For pushing things where they didn't need to go. Steven looked at him steadily. You didn't cross the line. The leader frowned. It felt like we did. Steven shook his head slightly. You stopped when it mattered. That surprised him. I didn't stop because I was strong, the leader admitted. I stopped because I realized I wasn't. Steven smiled faintly. That's usually when strength starts. They sat in silence again. The leader finally asked the question that had haunted him. Why didn't you finish it that night? Steven folded his hands. Because winning a fight ends a moment, he said. Ending the need for one lasts longer. The leader swallowed. I changed after that, he said. My crew changed, not all at once. But enough. Steven nodded. Then it worked. The leader stood, unsure what else to say. I won't forget that night, he said. Steven looked back at his book. You don't need to. At the door, the leader paused. Maybe I'll see you again. Steven didn't look up. Maybe you won't. Outside, the rain had slowed. The leader mounted his bike and rode away. Not with noise, not with speed, but with something lighter than before. Inside, Steven finished his coffee. Another lesson completed. Another road behind him. He paid the bill and stepped back into the quiet world, unnoticed once again. That was how it always went. The strongest moments of change rarely came with applause. They came with silence, with restraint, with someone choosing not to be what they could be, in order to be what they should be. And somewhere on 1,000 roads, the story continued. Not as a warning anymore, but as a reminder. Power doesn't come from domination. Respect doesn't come from fear. They come from knowing when to stop and walking away. Years passed. Not the kind that announce themselves, but the kind that slip by unnoticed, measured in worn tires, faded jackets and diners that change owners but never their smell. The story was still out there. It didn't get told as often anymore. But when it did, people leaned in, not because it was exciting, but because it felt true. It was no longer about a confrontation. It was about a moment when violence didn't happen. And those stories last, somewhere outside a desert town. A young biker argued with a stranger at a fuel pump. Voices rose, hands tensed. An older rider stepped in quietly. "Not worth it," he said. The younger one hesitated. "Why not?" The older rider didn't answer right away. He just shook his head. "Because I once met a man who taught me that strength doesn't need witnesses." The argument dissolved. Engines started. Lives went on. The lesson traveled farther than the man who inspired it ever did. Meanwhile, Steven Seagal continued the same way he always had: no headlines. No interviews about that night. No need to correct the exaggerated versions of the story. He passed through towns like a shadow, not hiding, just unannounced. Some people recognized him, most didn't. And that was fine. A small dojo in a city most maps barely mentioned. An instructor told his students something Steven had once said to him years earlier. Technique is what you practice. Character is what shows up when you don't want to use it. The students didn't know where the quote came from. They didn't need to. Across state lines, the former biker leader now ran a repair shop. Oil under his nails. Radio low, doors open. He never told customers who he used to be. But they noticed how he handled conflict. Fair prices. Straight talk, a steady voice when tempers flared. When a teenager once asked him why he never raised his voice, he smiled. Because the loudest guy in the room is usually the one trying to convince himself. That kid remembered it. Years later, the diner from that first night finally closed. A new place opened in its spot. Different name, same parking lot. No plaque, no marker, just asphalt where something important had not happened, and that mattered more than people realized. Steven passed through that town once more. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. Some moments are complete the instant they end. He drove on, watching the road stretch out endlessly ahead. He thought briefly about how many lives change, not because of what we do, but because of what we choose not to do. Then the thought passed. That was his way. Elsewhere, a group of bikers sat around a fire at night, quiet, reflective. Simona asked, "You ever wonder what would have happened if that fight went the other way?" Another shook his head. Number. Why not? Because we wouldn't be who we are now. That was the truth. The story never became a legend because of force. It became one because of restraint. Because someone showed that dominance is easy, but discipline is rare. And rare things reshape the world quietly. Eventually, people stopped asking what happened next, because they could see it. In calmer rooms. In conflicts that ended early, in men who learned to lower their voices instead of raising their fists. That's how real endings work. No final showdown, no applause, no closing speech, just lives adjusted slightly, permanently. And somewhere out there, the road continues, carrying lessons no one remembers learning, but everyone feels. Because the strongest stories don't end when the screen goes dark. They end when people live differently afterward. And that night by the diner. It didn't create fear, it created perspective. And that, more than anything else, is what stayed. There comes a point when every story stops being told, not because it isn't worth remembering, but because it has already done its work. Years after the night at the diner, most people who repeated the story could no longer say exactly when it happened. Details blurred, names faded, locations shifted. But the feeling stayed. The feeling that real strength doesn't announce itself, that danger doesn't always roar, that the quietest man in the room is often the one you should pay the most attention to. The road kept moving, as it always does. New riders replaced old ones. New diners opened where others closed. New conflicts appeared, smaller, quieter, less dramatic. And in those moments, the lesson surfaced without effort. Someone would lower their voice. Someone would step back. Someone would choose restraint when pride demanded escalation. They didn't know why. They just knew it felt right. Far from the highways and gas stations where the story was born, Steven Seagal lived the same way he always had. No speeches, no claims, no need to correct the myths. People sometimes recognized him. Sometimes they didn't. When they did, they expected something: confidence, toughness, a presence that filled the room. Instead, they found something quieter. He listened more than he spoke. He moved without urgency. He treated everyone the same. Not because he had to, but because it was simpler that way. Once at a small airport, a young man nervously asked him, "Is it true? All those stories about you?" Steven smiled politely. "Stories grow," he said. "Truth stays small." The young man didn't understand until years later. By then, he'd been in his own moments. Moments where anger felt justified, where force felt easy. And somehow, he remembered those words. Elsewhere, the former biker leader, older now, slower, watched his crew from a distance. They didn't need him the way they once had. That was the point. They handled disputes without fists. They rode without looking for reasons to prove themselves. They understood that respect came from consistency, not fear. Sometimes one of the younger riders would ask, "Where'd you learn that?" And the answer was always the same. From someone who didn't need to teach it. The world didn't change overnight. It never does. But it shifted subtly, permanently, the way water reshapes stone without anyone noticing. And that is how legacies really work. Not through headlines, not through domination, not through stories, shouted loud enough to drown out doubt, but through moments that redirect people quietly. The diner parking lot no longer existed. It was paved over, rebuilt, forgotten. Yet somewhere beneath the asphalt, the memory remained, not of violence, but of restraint, not of victory, but of choice. Steven drove less these days. When he did, he took back roads. The kind that didn't rush you anywhere. The kind that let you think. He understood something most people never learn. That the greatest test of power isn't whether you can win, it's whether you can walk away unchanged by ego. And when the road finally narrowed, when time slowed as it always does, he carried no regret about what he hadn't done. Only quiet certainty. Because strength that needs to be proven is already fragile, and respect that has to be demanded was never real to begin with. The story ended not with applause, not with confrontation, not with a final lesson spoken aloud. It ended the way it was always meant to, with people choosing differently, long after the man who inspired it had moved on. And that is how you know a story was never really about the man at all. It was about the moment someone decided not to be what they could be, and instead became what they should be. That is the kind of ending that never truly ends.